Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. How do you like my red tie? It's used to call it a they used to call this a power tie back in the 1980s when men would try to show, show their power through a red tie, impress other people. And I remember when Hillary Clinton debated Donald Trump, she wore an all red dress. It's kind of like the color of war. Anyway, today's topic is John Adams Part 5. We stopped last time in 1796, a very dramatic time in American history because George Washington was stepping down as president. So there would be the first disputed presidential election. Washington had been unanimously elected twice in 1788, early 89, and then 1792. So the two main candidates for president were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And Adams won the election, so he was elected the second president. And under the law back then, the electors in the Electoral College, they didn't designate for whom they were voting, president or vice president. And under the law, the man with the most electoral votes was president, and the man with the second most votes would be vice president. And this was not a good law, because you had Jefferson became vice president. He had been vying for the presidency as well. And then during Adams' presidency, Jefferson was the leader of the opposition. So this was not good. Eventually the law was changed so that the president and vice president would be elected on a ticket. They'd be elected together, and you wouldn't have this problem of having a vice president who would be an opponent of the president. And so anyway, so Adams was elected president that year. He and Abigail bought a new home in Massachusetts, which they named Peacefield. One kind of sad thing is Adams' cousin, Sam Adams, who was the governor of Massachusetts, he supported Thomas Jefferson in the election. Now, so he was president-elect moving into 1797. In January, in Philadelphia, which was the capital, there was a fire in the middle of the night. And back then, they didn't have these fire trucks. You know, they would have a bucket brigade. Guys would come out and help. They'd pass buckets of water and to help put out a fire from a well, presumably, to the source of the fire. And Adams was a part of this bucket brigade in the middle of the night, January 27th, 1797. The president-elect was out helping to put out a fire. He was inaugurated, John Adams, as the second president on March 4th in Philadelphia. And it was very hard. One of his big challenges was, the shadow of George Washington. Very hard, because Washington was so beloved and popular and respected. It was very hard. There was the inevitable comparison, and anyone would not compare well to George Washington. Now, in 1797, there was trouble with France. Actually, there had been trouble over the years with both Great Britain and France, who were the superpowers of the time, and they both had been abusive, and they were at war at this time. And the U.S. was trading with both countries. And so this was considered contraband, or trading with the enemy by both countries. And in 1797, the French stopped 300 American ships, and it took them by force, because they thought, well, this is aiding the enemy. So this is a real problem for the United States, because these American ships, this was a loss of property. And then, of course, the sailors would be arrested. So Adams had many challenges as president. One, his vice president was leader of the opposition. Adams this was the beginning of the two-party system. Adams was a Federalist, and Jefferson was the founder of what became the Democratic Party. It was originally called the Republican Party. It just changed its name. And a big mistake Adams made early on is he retained all of George Washington's cabinet. They were finding their way, trying to figure out what to do, and this was a big mistake, because his cabinet, the cabinet was loyal to Washington, and he really should have relieved them. He should have brought in a new cabinet of men who were loyal to him, because his cabinet was not loyal to him. In fact, they were the dominant person in the Federalist Party was Alexander Hamilton, who really gave Adams a lot of trouble, and so this was a big problem, a big mistake. In retrospect, he learned a political mistake, that he should have appointed men who would be loyal to him personally. Because, you have to work together. And so it was said that Abigail was his cabinet. He wasn't getting much support from his cabinet. And Jefferson was the leader of the opposition and got a lot of support from James Madison. Okay, well, the cards are stuck together here. Gosh darn it. And one of the big conflicts, well, actually, again, kind of like the Washington presidency, the dominant people during this time were Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. And they were feuding. And one of the questions was, who do you support in this conflict between Great Britain and France? Hamilton favored Great Britain, and Jefferson favored France. He was a big support. He lived in France. And then Adams was trying to remain neutral, just like Washington had done. We didn't want to have a fight with either country. One of the mistakes that Adams made is he gave his tacit support to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were passed in 1798. And this gave the president the power to deport, quote, dangerous foreigners, and made criticism of the government a crime. You know, this was a violation of free speech and freedom of the press, and the law wasn't in effect for very long. But it was bad. You know, some people were jailed, and especially newspapers were intimidated. And part of the reason they passed this, there was a lot of hysteria about France and Great Britain, and the country was very divided. And a few men were, but the law was allowed to lapse. And then the big mistake that was made is that, this was a mistake the Federalists made, and then the Democrats, or which were called Republicans then, they came up with the idea of nullification. That you could, that the states could just ignore law. If they thought federal law was wrong, they could just ignore it and not obey it. And that, of course, that led to the ideology which led to the Confederacy pulling out of the U.S. before the Civil War. And there was there's always a lot of exaggeration in politics. Some people said that John Adams was going to become king if he became president. That never happened. And others said that if Jefferson became king, there would be anarchy. And again, that did not happen when Jefferson became president. Now, there was this ongoing trouble with France. Originally, Americans really supported, a lot of Americans supported the French Revolution, especially the poor. And then there was these problems when the French were capturing American ships. So Adams sent a peace delegation trying to negotiate peace with the French in 1798. And the French, had become they were very arrogant. They thought they were superior. They thought the whole world should imitate their revolution and adopt what they had done and their principles and their type of government. So anyway, there was a bribe was solicited from the American diplomats, and when this became public, it was called the XYZ affair, and the public was outraged, and the public there was a strong support for war with France, and actually there was what was called the quasi-war in 1798. It was fought in the Atlantic Ocean. This is when the U.S. Navy was established by Adams, who thought that we needed to strengthen ourselves to have respect, to gain respect from the French, and especially, what they'd been doing had been violations of American shipping on the Atlantic, so we needed a navy to protect American ships. And the USS Constitution was one of those ships. It was called Old Ironsides, and in some of the fighting, the ship was made out of very hard wood, and reportedly these cannonballs bounced off the ship, and that's why they called it Old Ironsides. It's in the Boston Navy Yard today, and still a commissioned ship. Adams was very popular, as the public wanted war, and one of the reports, speculation. There's a lot of you come across some strange things when you study history. Reportedly, Alexander Hamilton was one of the biggest supporters. He wanted war, because for his own purposes, for his own ambition and his own self-glorification. And reportedly, he wanted war with France so that he could be head of the army, and that is true. And so he could conquer all of Latin America. And there's some truth to this. The Spanish Empire, the Spanish were very weak, and actually the independence was coming to the Spanish colonies in America. And he wanted to supposedly conquer Latin America and Louisiana and become King of America as province of Great Britain. Well, this is kind of crazy, but who knows? That's what some historians have written, speculated about. So as I said, the U.S. Navy was created on April 30th, 1798, as a part of the attempts to gain respect from France and to stand up to the French and their abuses in the Atlantic Ocean. In February of 1799, Adams actually decided we needed to remain at peace. He didn't want war. He was preparing for war to get respect and to be able to fight. And there was some fighting. But anyway, so he sent a peace mission to France in February of 1799 and really went against the public opinion, and especially that of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton wanted war. So Hamilton was furious because he was really the leader of the Federalist Party, and this peace mission was sent without consulting anyone. So there was a lot of criticism of Adams, and the public turned against him. His own party, the Federalist Party, was against him, and Hamilton was furious. And so he went home to Quincy. He went home to Quincy, where actually Abigail was sick during this time. Here he was president. He spent 7 months in Quincy, reportedly, another kind of a crazy thing from history, reportedly reading the collected works of Frederick the Great. And so, I thought that was you think, whoa, well, how about that? He's president. And again, back then, the government wasn't a year-round thing, that you didn't, although Washington hadn't spent that much time at Mount Vernon. He'd gone home, but not for 7 months. Anyway, March 9th, Adams declared, quote, a day of solemn humiliation, fasting, and prayer to implore God's pardon and mercy through the great mediator and redeemer, to seek his favor, to withhold from us unreasonable discontent from disunion, sedition, and insurrection. Kind of a political prayer there. Now, one of the major problems they were having during these times was yellow fever epidemics, which would, especially in Philadelphia, was vulnerable in the summer. And the government transferred from Philadelphia to Trenton, New Jersey in 1799 because of this yellow fever epidemic. Yeah, a lot of the guys, they would definitely leave in the summer to get away because it was unhealthy. And they'd be afraid to come back until it got cold and the mosquitoes all died. So that's what these yellow fever epidemics were. They were a real serious problem. Now, George Washington died in December of 1799, so this was very hard on our country, the death of George Washington. And as they said, as the famous eulogy by Light Horse Harry Lee, the father of Robert E. Lee, that George Washington was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. The capital transferred permanently to Washington, D.C. in 1800 in November, and as it turns out, Adams only was there for about 5 months, and because he only served one term. And his November 2nd, 1800, was his first day of working at the White House, which at that time was called the President's House in Washington City. It wasn't called Washington, D.C. yet. And so Adams was the first president in the White House. And he wrote a letter to Abigail on his first day of work. Abigail was back home in Quincy. Quote, I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and all that shall hereafter inhabit. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. In the 20th century, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had that quote engraved over the fireplace in the state dining room. So that'll be interesting to go look for that quote. Now, one of the things that, really a terrible thing, Alexander Hamilton was a very ambitious man, and he was furious with Adams for denying him what he thought would be his glory, that he would have tremendous achievements, military achievements, which would lead to political power. And remember, they're both in the same party, and Adams was the president, and Hamilton was really a dominant person in the party. And then 1800 was an election year. And Hamilton decided to write a pamphlet, an anti-John Adams pamphlet. And he said this in part, quote, not denying to Mr. Adams patriotism and integrity, and even talents of a certain kind, I should be deficient in candor, were I to conceal the conviction that he does not possess the talents adapted to the administration of government, and that there are great and intrinsic defects in his character, which unfit him for the office of chief magistrate. It is a fact that he is often liable to paroxysms of anger, which deprive him of self-command and produce very outrageous behavior to those who approach him. Disgusting egotism, the distempered jealousy. Now this, it was a very actually long pamphlet, and all anti-John Adams. Well, this was horrible. This was terrible, and it really helped. It was a factor in Adams' defeat in the election. You know, you have the dominant person in the Federalist Party writing something like this, and it boomeranged. It hurt Hamilton as well because people thought, this is wrong. How can you do something like this? Even if you don't like the guy, he's in your party. He's the president, and as president, you're the leader of the party. But so anyway, but it was Hamilton's reaction to Adams refusing to go to war with France. And so his determination to stay at peace with France cost him the 1800 election, and he lost the support of Alexander Hamilton. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected the third president of the United States, and he actually tied with Aaron Burr, and it was later resolved in the House of Representatives. So John Adams was a one-term president. And that's one of you could say, his claims to fame, that he saved our country from fighting a needless war with France. The election day was between May and December. Apparently the states voted at different times. It hadn't been resolved. There was one election day in November. By February, the votes had been counted, and it was clear that Adams had lost. In his last State of the Union address, he wrote this, quote, "Here and throughout our country, may simple measures, pure morals, and true religion flourish forever." Now, the previous year, he had visited his son Charles in New York City in October, and Charles was dying of alcoholism. Very tragic. And even more tragic was John's response. And he had this very ugly encounter where he called Charles a rake, a beast, and a madman possessed of the devil. He renounced his son. He vowed never to see him again. And this was terrible. Actually, very sad that. During this visit, and he never saw him again. Actually, they didn't have Alcoholics Anonymous back then. They didn't have rehab, and nothing really was done to try to help this. You think to yourself, why didn't he bring him home? And help him try to dry out and get off drinking. But he didn't, and so as Adams was losing the election, word came to him that they got news that Charles had died, November 30th, 1800. He was only 30 years old, and Abigail had visited him not too long previously, and he had cirrhosis of the liver, very, very sick, and he died. He must have been drinking a lot to die that young, and so he was gone, and this was a horrible tragedy. And I think Adams in later years really blamed himself for not being with. Spending enough time with him. He was gone for so many years, and Charles really grew up without a father for most of his childhood. And then Adams wrote after the death of Charles, quote, "The greatest grief of my heart and deepest affliction of my life." So this was horribly tragic. So this was a very tough time for him. Adams had been defeated for president, and his son Charles died of alcoholism. He wrote in December 1800, quote, "I shall leave the state with its coffers full, and the fair prospect of a peace with all the world smiling in its face, its commerce flourishing, its navy glorious, its agriculture uncommonly productive and lucrative. O my country, may peace be within thy walls and prosperity within thy palaces." So he felt pretty good about his presidency. Now his presidency was coming to an end in early 1801, and again, there was a fire in Washington City in January 20th, and the same thing. And here he was the president. He got out in the middle of the night. He went out to get in the bucket brigade, pass buckets of water to help put out the fire on January 20th, 1801, President of the United States. Adams appointed John Marshall Chief Justice of the Supreme Court on January 31, 1801. Some consider him the greatest Chief Justice in history. He served for 34 years. My father went to Cleveland Marshall Law School, named after John Marshall. Marshall had been at Valley Forge with George Washington in the Revolution. Adams believed that he had achieved peace through strength, through a strong defense. He created the U.S. Navy with 50 ships and 5,000 men. He prevented war with France when the public wanted it. And this is considered by historians a great achievement. He was attacked and betrayed by his cabinet and Thomas Jefferson. His mother died during this time. Abigail almost died. His son Charles died. Adams was a man of integrity. He was independent, patriotic. He had a good marriage, a sense of humor, and a love of life. Now, by March, when Jefferson was inaugurated, Adams did not stay. For that, the precedent hadn't been established. There hadn't been the tradition. He left at 4 in the morning on the stagecoach north to Boston, and the only sitting president in American history to not attend the inauguration of his successor. So he was back home in Quincy. He retired. He had a few visitors, unlike George Washington, who many people came to see him all the time. Adams didn't have that problem of entertaining them, and so. But over the years, he had sacrificed. He was an old guy here. He did not resume his legal career. He had sacrificed wealth for public service. He wrote this in 1801, quote, "The remainder of my days will probably be spent in the labors of agriculture and the amusements of literature, on both of which I have always taken more delight than in any public office of whatever rank." So he was looking forward to farming and reading and getting in the great outdoors and reading books. He loved reading books. He did consider resuming his legal career. However, he had no teeth. He worried he would mumble, slur his words, and make a bad impression on a judge or jury. So he decided that the law was out. The widow of Charles, his son Charles, Sally, moved in with their 2 daughters. And then later his other son Tom, who was struggling, also moved in with his wife and children. So the house was pretty full. They had a big house. Adams wrote this in 1802, quote, "The counsel which Themistocles gave to Athens, Pompey to Rome, Cromwell to England, and Colbert to France I have always given, and shall continue to give to my countrymen, because the great questions of commerce and power between nations and empires are determined at sea. All reasonable encouragement should be given to the Navy. The trident of Neptune is the scepter of the world." This was very prophetic. He was believing in naval power, the importance of naval power. He wrote a letter to Benjamin Rush in 1805, quote, "Is the present state of the national republic enough? Is virtue the principle of our government? Is honor, or is ambition and avarice, adulation, baseness, covetousness, the thirst for riches, indifference concerning the means of rising and enriching, the contempt of principle, the spirit of party, and of faction, the motive and principle that governs?" So, again, it's one of his themes he had is, we need to be a good people if we're going to succeed. And he wrote this again in 1806, quote, "I never could bring myself seriously to consider that I was a great man of much importance or consideration in the world. The few traces that remain of me must, I believe, go down to posterity in much confusion and distraction as my life has been passed." In 1809, Adams wrote this, quote, "Mausoleums, statues, monuments will never be erected to me. I wish them not. Panegyrical romances will never be written, nor flattering orations spoken to transmit me to posterity in brilliant colors. No, nor in true colors. All but the last I loathe." So I guess he wouldn't mind having people saying nice things about him in speeches. And he had many critics. He had this to say about critics in 1809, quote, "Let the jackasses bray or laugh at all this, as they did at the finger of God. I am in a fair way to give my critics and enemies food enough to glut their appetites." He started writing a lot to sort of vindicate himself to newspapers which were published. He came up with an epitaph for himself. In 1809, he wrote this, quote, "Here lies John Adams, who took upon himself the responsibility of peace with France in the year 1800. He's very proud of that he prevented this war. And he was referring to, this next quote, he's referring to all the writing he did to try to justify his life and his politics, his political actions. Quote, Voltaire boasted that he made 4 presses groan for 60 years, but I have to repent that I made the Patriot groan for 3 years. That was a newspaper, the Patriot. So when you make the presses groan, that means you're writing a lot. Adams claimed that not even Cicero was, quote, sacrificed to the vengeance of Antony more egregiously than John Adams was to the unbridled and unbounded ambition of Alexander Hamilton and the American triumvirate. In opposition to, quote, all their diabolical intrigues, he had heartily pursued his own system in 1799 and 1800, made peace with France at the expense of all my consequence in the world and their unanimous and immortal hatred. Yeah, he was really bitter about Alexander Hamilton, what Hamilton had done, because of his own thwarted ambitions when Adams was able to keep the peace with France. Adams wrote this in 1810, quote, the banking infatuation pervades all America. An aristocracy is growing out of them that will be as fatal as the feudal barons if unchecked in time. I agree with this. You know, these big banks, they have this idea now, oh, the banks are too big to fail. So they have to get bailed out by the government. So I think we really need to we need a new banking system, and I don't think it'll happen anytime soon because the bankers have tremendous power, and they don't want their power taken away. Quote, he wrote in 1811, quote, have I not been employed in mischief all my days? Did not the American Revolution produce the French Revolution? And did not the French Revolution produce all the calamities and desolations to the human race and the whole globe ever since? I meant well, however. My conscience was as clear as a crystal glass, without a scruple or doubt. Yeah, he's feeling kind of bad here, especially the French. The French Revolution was believed was inspired by the American Revolution, and the French Revolution was a disaster. So many people died in all the wars in France, and so many Frenchmen had died. He wrote this in 1811, quote, I was borne along by an irresistible sense of duty. God prospered our labors, and awful, dreadful, and deplorable as the consequences have been, I cannot but hope that the ultimate good of the world, of the human race, and of our beloved country is intended and will be accomplished by it. Yeah, he had his doubts. He was hoping that it was all for the best. The War of 1812 broke out in 1812, and the British, during that war, the British they came into Washington City, and they set a number of buildings on fire, including the White House. So the President Madison and government had to get out, had to leave. And Adams wrote, quote, it was worse during the Revolution when Congress was chased like a covey of partridges from Philadelphia to Trenton, from Trenton to Lancaster. The similar thing had happened in the American Revolution when the government had to flee Philadelphia and the Congress, and when the British came. Now, it was one of the sad things is Adams and Jefferson had been estranged. They'd been very good friends, especially in Europe. They spent a lot of time together, and then because of politics, because of their own ambitions, they were estranged. They became political enemies, and their friendship really was lost. But in 1812, it was restored, and they started writing. They never saw each other again, but they started writing very affectionate letters to each other. And Adams renamed his home Montezillo, kind of like Monticello. Monticello was the high hill, Montezillo the small hill. So he renamed Peaceville in honor of his restored friendship with Thomas Jefferson. That was a very nice thing. In 1813, his daughter Nabby died of breast cancer at age 48. It was very hard. She had surgery, and medical care was really terrible back then. And she had a mastectomy, and she really suffered. She came home. She died at home. She died at the home in Quincy, and this was very hard. Adams wrote this, quote, the love of God in his creation, joy, triumph, exultation in my own existence are my religion. It was very tough. Well, it appears we are out of time. We'll continue next time and wrap up the life of John Adams, the second president of the United States. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you find a good history book to read. God bless you. See you next time.